So good afternoon to everybody. We are starting our traditional webinar with a very important topic. And my name is Andrius Kubilius. I am a member of European Parliament, and I am standing rapporteur on Russia, and also leading different informal activities like United for Ukraine network and also Friends of European Russia Forum. Today, the topic of our conversation has a very specific title: Western fears of Russia defeat in Ukraine. When will the pro-Ukraine coalition become an anti-Putin coalition? That is the topic is inspired by several very interesting and very important publications by several of writers, analysts whom we have today: Vladislav Inozemtsev, Valery Pekar, Gary Kasparov, who spoke about that topic, and which is devoted to a situation which I was speaking about, in different occasions, on different occasions also, was very simple question. At least as I see the situation, the Western support to military assistance to Ukraine for time being is only on such a level which allows Ukraine not to lose the war, but it's really not enough for the victory. And unfortunately, for time being, there's no victory plan, what we can call, and at least in my calculations, in order for Ukraine to win this war, the Western assistance, military assistance to Ukraine should be increased by almost 3 times, from 40 billion euros per year up to 100 billion. And that is still not very clear how it can be done. And the reason why we have such a situation, one of the reasons is that on one side, still we see that the Western capitals, some of them, have quite a lot of fear of where Ukrainian victory and defeat of Putin, defeat of Russia can lead. And this is a fear of what will happen with Russia if Ukraine is winning the war. And in addition to that, this is one of the reasons why what we can call pro-Ukraine coalition, which is declaring, support Ukraine, is not becoming anti-Putin coalition. And I did my own very simple, what I call Google research. When you enter, putting the words, some specific words onto the Google, and looking how much you are getting reports. So, for example, the words "victory of Ukraine," if you will put into Google, you can see that there are quite a lot of different statements on that topic by some leaders, by different organizations, including European Parliament. But if you will put the words "defeat of Russia," you will have very limited, limited number of answers, and usually those are not the leaders of the West, and even European Parliament till now was not using such a language, which shows that something is, I don't know even how to say it, psychological problem or problem of political will or understanding of what is at stake. So I will not elaborate too much, about other circumstances which we are facing, but this is perhaps, exactly, it describes quite well where we are, after 2 years of the war. And from my point of view, really, we need to do quite a radical change in mentality of the West and in attitude of the West towards the war. And really, we can look into what was done by the Western coalition, during Second World War, and we can see very clearly what is still missing. You know, we do not have anti-Putin coalition. We do not have victory plan. We do not have, you know, clear declaration like Roosevelt and Churchill did in 1943 that the goal of the war is unconditional surrender of Hitler. We do not have anything like that, you know, in this war. And still we do not have, you know, something like plan for Russia after the war, like it was done by Americans, you know, and allies when they were speaking about post-war Germany. So that is where we are for the time being. And the question is how we can move forward. And that is why we're doing this webinar. And I am very happy that we have really very prominent speakers. Some of them, as I said, you know, recently published some very, very interesting and important articles, like Vladislav Inozemtsev, Gary Kasparov, and Valery Pekar from Ukraine. Also, we shall have two very well-known Western, let's say so, experts like Benjamin Tallis from Germany, and Maria Mandras, which she will join us a little bit later, from France. That is our group of conversation. As usually, we are doing this conversation web streamed. I will ask speakers to have introductory remarks up to 7 minutes. Then we shall have time for Q&A. Please, everybody, write your questions into the chat. And also there is interpretation into Russian language available for those who need that possibility. So now I will start then from Vladislav Inozemtsev, who recently published in Russian language very good article. I will not translate the title. I will read it in Russian language, but maybe you will understand what is about. Coalition
is different from coalition, or the prerequisite for winning Russia.
Go on. Unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kubilis, and your team who is responsible for this for today's event. I will try to be quite short and put together some of my thoughts, which actually transcend the article I published several weeks ago. So I got the text Mr. Kubilis disseminated among the participants, and I would say I fully agree with it till the point number 5, which says that the change in Russia comes from the Kremlin, and the revolt on the top of the Russian nomenclature or the Russian elite can be the way forward to transform Russia. I agree with this completely. But then it comes to more debatable issues. First of all, is the issue about why pro-Ukraine coalition doesn't evolve into anti-Putin one. I would say that for me, it's quite natural because pro-Ukraine coalition doesn't have any potential to be anti-Putin coalition, because the idea of victory of Ukraine over Russia and the idea of defeating Russia is, to my mind, quite counterproductive for 2 reasons. First, of course, it's a very noble idea, and we all are supporting independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine, but we should understand that if Ukraine is liberated in 1991 borders, so before it happens, we will by 99% will have a nuclear strike by Mr. Putin using at least tactical nuclear weapons. And this is why the West is very aware of this scenario. It's not about the split of Russia. It's not about the collapse of the Russian Federation. It's mostly about this, crazy actions Mr. Putin can undertake when he believes he is defeated or he might be defeated. The second point is about the defeat of Russia, because as Mr. Kubilis noted, the President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill declaration, I would cite the Atlantic Charter of 1942, which was telling us about the final destruction of the Nazi regime. It was not talking about the destruction or crushing of Germany. It was talking about the regime which existed in Germany. Talking about the defeat of Russia, we give a lot of arguments to Mr. Putin's hands, because what caused the Russian aggression against Ukraine? It was a national humiliation which was injected into the minds of the Russian people by Mr. Putin because of the defeat in the Cold War and because of this, terrible condition of Russia and the attitude of the West towards Russia. So if Russia is defeated, my proposal will be, and my assumption will be, that we will have another, in some time, we will have another huge rise of Russian revanchism, and another Putin will rise, and the same kind of situation will repeat. So, therefore, I don't believe in the idea that the victory of Ukraine will result in Putin's collapse and in Russia's change. This is the most important point we should actually think about, because now the opposite vision is absolutely prevailing. But I doubt that a victory of Ukraine is synonymous of Russian freedom and Russia's return to a civilized community. So my point number two, how could this anti-Putin coalition arise? The war in Ukraine is the biggest war waged in Europe since 1945, but nevertheless, it is localized in Ukraine. And the Western powers, France, Germany, United States, they of course are very much concerned with this war, but they don't anticipate it as their personal and immediate danger. And this is, I think, the most prominent issue, because everyone can say, yes, the war is going on, but it is going on not in our land, not in our backyard. Maybe on our backyard, but not in our house. And this is a big mistake, because as Mr. Kasparov recently noted, and he knows this perfectly well, Putin is waging war against the West, has been waging this war for at least 20 years so far. And it's everywhere. We have a lot of proofs for this war. There are killings of different people, like Russian dissidents or Chechen fighters in European countries. They are meddling into the elections. There is a support of different, ultra-right and ultra-left parties in Europe. There are real, I would say, assaults on the European territory, like it was when the Russians blew up military installations or military storage facilities in Czech Republic. There is, an assassination attempt towards the American people, like, in Havana Syndrome, when the American diplomatic missions abroad were targeted by the GRU, Chief Intelligence Service of Russia. And nothing of this provoked a huge and collective response from the West. I will remind you when this Havana Syndrome first occurred. It was in 2016, 8 years ago. And for 6 years, the Central Intelligence Office made a huge work, again, headed by its current leader, William Burns, former ambassador in Moscow. And guess when they said that there was no Russian involvement? It was January 2022. February 2022, Putin invaded Ukraine. So the failure of the West to react harshly and boldly on all the examples of the Russian aggression against the West, directly against the West, actually fueled what Putin did in Ukraine. And so therefore, my point would be that if we want to build an anti-Putin coalition, we should take into account several very important issues. First, it should be anti-Putin, not anti-Russian. It should target, the main idea should be to bring Putin down and bring him accountable, maybe to the Hague, maybe in some other way, but it's not about immediately changing Russia. It's about taking Putin out of the scheme. All measures here are good. You can corrupt the Russian elite who can organize a coup. You can, meddle in trying to do several attempts in sanction policy. You can lift sanctions from some part of the Russian elite to, ignite an inter-elite struggle inside Russia. Everything is possible just for bringing Putin down from this system. It's not about crushing Russia on the front. It's not about $100 billion for Ukraine. Maybe it's enough, $1 billion, it's enough to take Putin out of the system. But this is a primary issue, because if Russia is defeated with Putin staying inside, it would be even more dangerous country than it is now. The last point I will make about the collapse of Russia. I don't think this is the biggest problem we face. Yes, I agree also once again with Mr. Kasparov, who says that we don't know what Russia will be after Putin is out, after it maybe crumbles. But we surely know what it will be, the Russian victory in Ukraine and somewhere else, in Africa or in some other regions of the world. We don't know. It's an advent of a dictatorship, of a cruel totalitarian dictatorship which arose in the last 20 years. So my point here, once again, is that we shouldn't fear and we shouldn't be concerned too much with something what happens after. We should come to this point, then Putin is out of the system, and then we will see. And then we will act accordingly. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Vladislav. Yeah, a lot of immediately a lot of thoughts in order to comment, but I will keep my chance for later time. Now I will turn immediately to Gary Kasparov, who also published a very interesting article where he quoted also Vladislav Inozemtsev, and the article was devoted to Russia's Taiwan, if I'm correctly announcing the title of the article. But again, we are happy to have Gary Kasparov with us, and please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So very happy to be here today. Yeah, I agree with the main thesis of Vladislav that it must be a separation between Putin and Russia. But the problem is today it's a bit difficult because Russia is at war, and where we depart our thinking is that I don't believe anything will happen in Russia and with Putin until Russia is soundly defeated on the battleground. Yeah, the parallels with Nazi Germany are just quite implausible here. And again, it's the plan laid down by Roosevelt and Churchill back in 1943 in Casablanca was unconditional surrender, but it couldn't have happened without military defeat. And we know that this is all the changes could happen only when the elite recognizes that the war is being lost. The only serious attempt against Hitler was on July 20th, 1944, after the D-Day, after the invasion of Normandy, when it was very clear that Germany was crumbling. And let's not forget, Prigozhin's attempt to change the cause of the war, basically to force Putin to negotiate, was a result of the fear of Russian military command that American help, which was on the way, could push Ukrainian armies deep into Russian defense because they didn't know the outcome. And only after they realized that America was not there to help Ukraine to win the war, so that Prigozhin actually was doomed, and Putin now is back in charge. And today, I think he's fully in control for a simple reason. Many Russians believe that Russia is winning the war, but it's also very important, and I will go back to the same narrative. Putin's propaganda succeeded convincing that this is a war between Russia and the West. And that's where I agree with Vladislav. We have to fight this narrative. But before we fight, we just have to look in the West and recognize that it's many things that are happening now, the tragedy of Ukraine and tragedy in many other places where Putin's fingerprints can be found, whether it's in Africa or the Middle East, is a result of the denial of the free will to recognize that we're at war. I mean, let's be very honest. It's a war, and it's not just war in Ukraine. It's a war between two visions of the future. Actually, one is future and one is the past. But unfortunately, Putin is successful because the free world is not willing to fight back. we're trying to find kind of compromises. We're still trying to believe that we can coexist. The message should be very simple. There is no coexistence between the free world and Vladimir Putin's vision of the world, which brings us back. Putin is war. And by the way, same as with Iran. Less with China yet, but China is just it's like behind the curtain. But basically, we are dealing with terrorists and dictators around the world that made war and confrontation like the oxygen. They can't exist in a different atmosphere. And the war in Ukraine is the best illustration of Putin's plans to push forward, without any regard to the cost, whether human or material. And while Putin is at war with the West, I'm not saying that. He's been saying this. Russian propaganda keeps saying that their plans are simply to reverse the world order, to destroy EU, to destroy NATO, and to spread their influence around the world. You look at Africa now. Very soon, if we do nothing, the whole Africa, from Red Sea to Atlantic Ocean, will be under control of Russia's and Chinese dictators. Middle East, Iran is definitely having Russian backing to push through, and Hamas is just one of the KGB clients, so that's not, or Hezbollah. So our message should be, the free world must wake up. It's a war, which means you should not operate with the rules made at the peacetime. Why Hungary is still voting in EU? Oh, we have made rules. Peacetime. War means somebody broke the rules. Kick out Orban. Basically, now you didn't do that. Slovakia is following. Putin is openly corrupting Western elections. And we pretend that, we can still play the game. No. Show strength. Strength is the only way to start slowing first Putin's advance. And then again, it's about defeat. Defeat of Putin regime is fundamental. And that's why it's pro-Ukraine coalition. For me, it's meaningless now because, again, Ukraine is the front line of the battle between tyranny and freedom. But Ukrainian victory means Putin's defeat. It's very difficult now to differentiate between Putin's and Russia. So that's why I have a proposal. We have been talking about it. We have millions of Russians, maybe a few millions, it's not a big number, that do not want to be part of Putin's Russia. They should be given a chance to form what I half-jokingly call Russian Taiwan. People that don't want to be part of Russia, they don't want to be responsible for these crimes. And we have a lot of them now that just are hanging in the air because they cannot leave Russia. They cannot go anywhere. And that's a way to win the war, to add Russian component, Russian contingent to the coalition. This is how we destroy the Putin's narrative. 2 or 3 million of Russians, many of them, by the way, computer experts, financiers, engineers, if they can leave Russia, if they can offer a chance to accept Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, to cut ties with Putin regime, to call it criminal, and illegitimate. So that will become a very important part of the coalition for winning the war and changing Russia. And that's, by the way, could be our contribution for the future. Again, number might be small, but 100,000 engineers leaving Russia means maybe 100,000 missiles less flying to Ukraine. Again, we need a strategy first. And strategy should be defeating Putin regime because there's no coexistence. Any Western politicians who is trying to mumble, we have to find compromises, go to hell. There's no compromise. Any compromise means Ukrainians will pay more and more, and eventually Putin will move forward again. It's not, I'm saying, it's just he is not hiding his plans. It's very, very clear that he believes that he's in the position now to dictate the terms. And with Donald Trump potentially taking over Oval Office 8 months or 10 months from now, so we'll be in a very, very precarious situation. So it's time to wake up as long as we have this time, and to build a coalition that will make it very clear: military victory for Ukraine, defeat of Putin regime, and creating Russian component of this victory, offering people like myself and many others a chance to become part of this coalition, sometimes going against emotions of Ukrainians. We understand them. But again, they should recognize that you cannot beat Putin without having a strong Russian contingent among those nations who are fighting to preserve and advance liberal world order. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mr. Kasparov. Really as always, very inspirational statement, very clear, and a lot of things which we can, at least myself, I can agree absolutely. Now we're turning to Ukrainian side. Valery Pekar, with whom we had several occasions to to speak in different webinars of our network. And Valery really also was publishing very important, very interesting articles. Especially, I picked this article about the fears in the West, which very much coincided with my own view. What is the problem, for the victory of Ukraine? Those fears in the West, and without any long introduction, I would really ask Valery Pekar, economist, lecturer, co-founder of NGO Nova Ukraina, to take the floor.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, since the beginning of the Russian invasion to Ukraine, the peoples and governments of the democratic world have supported Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity, and political leaders have made promises to provide ongoing support to Ukraine as long as it takes. Unfortunately, nobody knows what it means. What does it mean, it takes? And while Western elites continue to support Ukraine, they also worry about the potential collapse of Russia following the defeat on the battlefield. What risks Western elites see and what they are afraid of? There are four major risks. First is proliferation of nuclears, uncontrolled proliferation during the collapse of Russia. Second is huge humanitarian crisis, millions of refugees, total war of everybody against everybody, the warlords on the territories and so on, ethnic cleansings and so on, in a huge scale, much greater than Balkan wars. A third risk is the risk of radical Islamism, which could spread across Northern Caucasus and even Volga region and some other regions. And risk number four is growth of Chinese influence, when China will simply come in and take everything which they need in Russia. They need a lot of. Four risks of Russian collapse are unacceptable, and let's discuss how we can avoid these risks and prevent them. So the war any war is always a zero-sum game, which means win-lose, or maybe even a negative-sum game, lose-lose. Can we transform the war into a win-win game? Can we make this wonder and make the win-win game, which looks impossible? But yes, it is possible if we don't identify Russia and the Russian Federation and as the same thing. Russia and the Russian Federation are different things, absolutely. So Russian studies led the West to a Moscow-centric outlook by including the same Russian discourse and Russian studies, not only on peoples of Russian Federation, which according to Russian official statistics comprises some around 30% of the population. The real figure is much bigger, maybe it is much greater than 40% probably, according to some Russian experts. And but also Russian studies include traditionally even countries which are out of Russia, like Ukrainians, Estonians, Lithuanians, Georgians, and so on, and Uzbeks. How it is possible? Because of the great trap, which I will highlight later on. So we can transform the war into a win-win game. The empire can lose and the Russian Federation can win. This is possible. Putin's Russia is an extremely centralized state. It is declared to be a federation, but it is not a federation. Subjects of the federation have neither self-government nor rights for their national resources, nor rights to maintain and develop their cultures, languages, religions, no right to keep their own history, and even in the cases if their statehood came earlier than Moscow statehood. And the strength and aggressiveness of Putin's regime is based on extremely centralized budget, which on a top-down base allocates just small pieces of money to regions, pumping out their natural wealth and ensuring their poverty and subsidization. This is exactly what they do. So then, how it is possible that everybody is focused only on Moscow? This is because of traditional trap of Moscow centrism. This trap was prepared by Moscow intellectuals for the West, and the West was catched in this trap not 10 years ago, not 30 years ago, but a half of a century ago, because of traditional Russian studies, traditional Russian culture, which includes traditionally art from other nations of Soviet Union and Russian Federation and so on. So we Ukrainians know pretty well this trap of Moscow centrism. From 1991, famous Chicken Kiev speech when the President of the United States visited Kiev just 3 weeks before Ukraine proclaimed its independence and told us about great catastrophe of dissolution of Soviet Union. Soviet Union was dissoluted the same year, and it was not a catastrophe. It was a way to democracy for many nations of Soviet Union. All this is based on the greatest geopolitical mistake of the century. The greatest geopolitical mistake of the century is that Russia should be kept as an empire to protect the West from its greatest opponent, China. This is not true. You cannot use this aggressive empire against China because it is already a satellite of China. So what you can do to transform this into a peaceful federation to rebellions in power. And I'm very grateful to European Parliament, which in its resolution of February 29th this year, very clearly and strongly stated that de-imperialization, decolonization, and refederalization of Russia is absolutely necessary conditions for the establishment of democracy in Russia, the only way to do this. And thank you, Mr. Kubilis, for that as well, as a member of the European Parliament. So finally, what to do? We should transform the empire into a federative state, which to achieve a liberation of Ukraine, to provide assurances for all neighbors of Russia and to the whole Europe, and to dramatically decrease uncertainty of the war. What to do? We need everything. We need all the things which were already mentioned and even more. Indeed, we need declarations and manifestos, but we could not limit ourselves to declarations and manifestos. We should support local elites and to communicate to local elites in Russian Federation in different, first of all, in national republics. We should spend money to spread civic education in Russia to prevent chaos and to create horizontal networks of citizens in a very automized and polarized Russian society. We should support direct military forces like Russian Volunteer Corps or Legion Freedom for Russia, which also show real opposition, military opposition to Putin regime, which proves that Putin is not equal to Russia. Because every day Moscow propagandists, Kremlin propagandists try to explain that Putin is equal to Russia. As already was mentioned and explained by Mr. Nazemtsev, this is necessary to mobilize Russian population to support the war. So Putin is not Russia. Russia isn't Putin. Russian Federation could survive without Putin. And this is the way. Simply changing Putin to Putin 2.0, then to Putin 3.0 is not the way. The way is deep political transformation of Russian regime from imperial state to a federal state. Paradoxically, I will end with a paradoxical statement that defeat of Russia is the only hope for all peoples of Russia. But this defeat should be not only on the battlefield, this is important, but also in the sphere of humanitarian policy, cultural policy, political system, and so on. So simply removing Putin or defeating Russian forces without removing Putin is not the end of the game. This is just an intermediate point of the game. We cannot win without strategy. Sorry, dear Western colleagues, we cannot win without strategy. It looks like the West has no strategy for now, and what we are proposing now is a strategy of victory. And I am grateful to Mr. Nazemtsev and to Mr. Kasparov, which contributed to understanding of this strategy. This strategy should be clear, this strategy should be stated, and we should accumulate resources to perform the strategy and to win and to establish sustainable peace in Europe. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Valeria, as always, very precise and clear messages. Now, immediately I'm turning to, let's say, so Western side. And the first, well, we are joined also by Maria Mandras, but now I am asking Benjamin Tallis, Senior Research Fellow, Head of Action Group Zeitenwende, and representing German Council on Foreign Relations. Please, Benjamin.
Thank you very much indeed, Andreas. A pleasure to join this discussion today, and thanks to the colleagues who've gone before who've very well laid out a number of issues involved. I should say that I'm not German. I'm a Brit living in Germany, but I follow the debate here very closely and participate in it as well. First, I think it's a timely discussion, but I have to disagree with one of the assumptions. I don't think we have a pro-Ukraine coalition, truly, at the moment. And so the talk of an anti-Putin coalition is perhaps premature. I would like to see a pro-Ukraine coalition that supported Ukraine to win. Much as Valery Pekar just noted, we need a strategy for that. And we don't have a strategy for that, nor do we have a consistent coalition who are committed to a common definition of Ukrainian victory. And we are lacking this. And I'm going to go into why Germany is part of that problem in just a second. But it's also important to be clear about what we mean by victory. As a very basic shorthand, 1991 borders, so control of Kiev restored over its 1991 borders, and the people living within them, crucially. Ukraine able to defend itself and sustain itself as a democratic state in NATO and on the way to EU membership, I think is a reasonable definition that we could hold out of what victory actually looks like. So military victory, but also there's more elements to it than that. We have to think of the kind of peace we want afterwards. So a stable security order in Europe with Ukraine as part of the security architecture is extremely important. Now, of course, we have seen some countries within NATO and within the European Union commit to this. We've seen the strong commitment of the Baltic states. We've seen the Nordics commit to this. We've seen Czechs and Poles talking about this. And even in the last 2 days, we've seen the UK and France, rhetorically at least, affirm their commitment once again. David Cameron and Stéphane Séjourné had a joint piece in the Daily Telegraph yesterday talking about the need for Russia to be defeated in Ukraine, the essential nature of this conflict to the security of those two countries. So that's extremely welcome, but none of those countries, or even those countries combined, are willing or able to commit the money or the material to make that victory happen as it stands. Those who are not committed to victory. And this is the problem. The German government likes to talk a lot about how much it's done, how much it's spent, the highest in overall terms of the European countries on supporting Ukraine, both on military and other assistance. But relatively speaking, compared to GDP, it's still way behind, of course. And moreover, the bigger problem and why Germany isn't getting the credit that the Scholz government thinks they should for this is that they're not committed to victory. I don't know if everyone's clear on this, but Olaf Scholz still actually hasn't said Ukraine should win. He has repeatedly said Ukraine should not lose and Russia should not win. But that's a world of difference from saying that Ukraine should win. And that hesitancy is really reflected in the German policy. We've seen the foot dragging over every single weapon system to be delivered. We have seen now the reluctance to deliver the Taurus missiles that would help Ukraine in its move to active defense, help pin back Russia by targeting its logistics, its command and control, etc., by making Crimea less tenable for the occupiers, and so on. we see that hesitance. We see also in the US, the Congress has totally dropped the ball on this. The US administration has let Ukraine down massively in this regard. And so the material and the money is not there to commit to victory. So I think it's very important to outline that first. Now, there's different reasons for this in different countries, but let me talk about the German case a little bit here. And this is something we wrote about together with colleagues last year in a piece called Who's Afraid of Ukraine's Victory, and which we've written about again recently in an open letter to Chancellor Olaf Scholz, asking him to change course and support Ukraine to win. There's two main reasons. One is fear. And the fear is of what has been described by the colleagues in the chat of Russian collapse as one thing, or Russian escalation on the other hand. If defeat seems to become a possibility, there is a fear that Russia would escalate the conflict. And I mean, frankly, it's just cowardice at this stage dealing with it in that way, saying that Ukrainians should be taking the suffering here, but Germans shouldn't be touched. It's also a big misunderstanding of deterrence. There's almost no deterrence or nuclear IQ in German decision-making, which it fails to understand how we're actually kept safe by our current military arrangements. Of course, there are clouds on the horizon in that regard, with the potential uncertainty over the US security guarantee. But up till now, we've had that guarantee, and these arguments are still made. So I think there's also something else driving this. So fear, that twofold fear is the one part: fear of escalation, fear of Russian collapse, etc. But those are both really unlikely events. And at the moment, the German government is prioritizing these very unlikely, potentially negative consequences, which we don't know what the actual full consequences would be, over the certainty of the harm that Russia as it is doing, and the certainty of the harm it will continue to do. So it seems as though there's some flawed decision-making going on there. But that's also to do with the second group of reasons, which are in opposition, actually, to Ukraine's victory. Why is this? So a lot of people talk about German history in this regard, but I think that's misleading. I think it's actually a question about the future. It's about the way that the German government, and particularly the Scholz chancellery, and so we're talking Olaf Scholz, we're talking Wolfgang Schmidt and Jens Plötner, the foreign policy team there, how they see this war. They see the war as a system-transforming war. And they don't want that, because they see that Ukraine's victory would accelerate the process of systemic competition, of bloc formation between democracies and autocracies. And that would require a level of change from Germany that they are ill-equipped to deliver, frankly speaking, with the capabilities they have, but also that they don't want, because they want to cling to as much of the world of yesterday as possible, the world from which Germany did very well after the end of the Cold War. So I think there is a real reluctance to actually support Ukraine's victory there, because it would bring about this level of change. And it would also bring about the kind of change in Germany's relation to China that would be extremely difficult for Germany to pull off. There's all sorts of contradictions in this. And you mentioned that I head the action group Zeitenwende for DGAP. Spoiler alert, there has been no Zeitenwende. We're still waiting for it to happen in any meaningful term, because geopolitical considerations are not factored into Germany's trade relationships properly still. So dependence on China, and also its dependence on China for its green transition as well. There's a lot of mixed up thinking going on here, and a lot of fingers crossed foreign policy that's continuing to happen, which shows that there hasn't really been this change. But in trying to explain why Germany is not actually prioritizing Ukraine's victory, I think it's important to emphasize those things. Lastly, two points. There's been a lot of talk about what would happen if Russia were to lose the war. I think it's actually not the greatest concern of the West. I think actually what we need to be able to do is to make sure that we contain the negative external effects of any Russian policy. So even if, for example, the next ruler of Russia would be worse than Putin, he's only as bad internationally as we allow him to be. And this is a lesson that we have yet to properly learn. So what Russians do inside Russia is pretty much up to them. What they do outside Russia has to be our priority. And so contain, deter, and isolate any future Russia that is not committed to the democratic world. Hopefully that creates the pressure for change inside, but it's not our priority. Last thing is just to really back up what Garry Kasparov said about we're still playing by the old rules. We're still playing by rules that are really inadequate to our current situation. And we followed the rules and burned the house down is not a credible approach to politics or frankly anything else. And so continuing to say that our hands are tied by those rules, so we can't actually deal with the subversion we see within the European Union from Hungary, or that we have to follow old export rules and so on about weapons, is really to misunderstand the nature of the threat. And so that's where I'll end, is to say I think there's been a misunderstanding and a miscalculation of the threat. There is not calculation of the upside of Ukraine's victory, and consequently there is no commitment to it. So before we get to a pro-Putin an anti-Putin coalition, I'd like to see a pro-Ukraine coalition committed to victory. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Benjamin. And now we're turning to the French, point of view. Professor Maria Mandras joined us, professor at Sciences Po University, and author of the recent book about the war. I will not, I'm not using French language, so for me it's quite difficult task to pronounce the whole title, but we know Professor very well. And of course, as politicians and as very much, involved into issues of Ukrainian, Ukraine, Russia, and so on. Of course, we, with a lot of interest, are watching now and listening to recent statements by President Macron and the government, and yesterday statement by Sejourné and Cameron looked like very interesting, because the first time when I see, before that, maybe you didn't had a chance to hear us. I was saying that I did Google research, and I haven't found, any statements about defeat of Russia. And then, exactly after I made my research, suddenly, almost the next day, President Macron said, something about Russia defeat. And yesterday, exactly, the statement was, again, very indicative for me and very interesting. So please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Good afternoon to all of you. It's always a pleasure, and it's with much interest that I listen to the previous speakers. I believe, Andreas, that you are right. Positions are changing, things are changing, and this is, I think, what we should study first and foremost is what has been changing in our countries, rather than repeat all the mistakes that we've made in recent years. The French position has changed, and President Macron has read my book, or at least parts of it, as I understand. And the position now is very clearly in Paris that the Russian army must be defeated, which means that Putin's state must be defeated. And this is very interesting, because if you remember, Andreas, a few months ago when I spoke here, I was the only one to say the really productive scenario can only be a military surrender of Russia, followed by the surrender of the Putin state, which is exactly what happened in 1945, Nazi Germany, in very different circumstances, of course, and the Federation of Russia has not been bombed, it's not occupied, and it's very different. But still, it seems to me that most of us now understand, maybe not in Berlin, although I know many people in Berlin who are exactly on the same line now as the French president and French government's line, which is that the Putin dictatorship can in no way survive a military defeat. And this is the scenario that we must present, I think, to our people, to all governments in Europe and elsewhere, as the only sensible and exit from the war. Now, this is said, I read with much interest your memorandum, Andreas, and your 12 points. And I'd like to respond to this, because I think we should all together work on a follow-up. That is, go into more practical, tactics, how to implement this strategy. The first thing I would question is the notion of the West. The West doesn't exist. So I think it's better that we stop using it. It's making things very confused, and the West may be rather popular in Germany, but in France, the notion of the West, l'Occident, is absolutely not a popular or much used phrase. We prefer to talk about countries and institutions. So we know what the European Union is. And by the way, dear friends, we have European Parliament elections coming up in June. And this is key, but we can come back to that in the discussion. The West is not NATO. We have NATO, so we can talk of NATO institutions. We can talk of, if we want, of the Council of Europe and other institutions, even if Russia is still a member. And we have to be much more attentive to whom are the major players in this. And so if the West, which is sort of very vague and ill-defined concept, who are the players? Where they're the states, and so each one of us knows pretty well the situation in our own country. Then we have the EU institutions, NATO. We have the US, Canada, Japan, Australia. We also have big companies. We also have big media and social networks. And we have our public opinions, and we have the military as well. And I certainly, cannot list them all. So why do we study to put in practice a real strategy? Why don't we study the possibilities to improve or influence the behavior of all those major players? We also have the toxic players, which were already mentioned, like Iran, China, terrorist organizations, governments like Viktor Orban's governments, and that we have to be very attentive to. I find also that a key player is not studied enough, and I will be asking Valerie to say a little more. It's Ukraine. I think we need to be much better informed about Ukraine, what's happening in each region, everywhere, about the politics of Ukraine, and what should be included in our strategy is certainly a policy towards Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia. I mean, in other words, what we call today the other Europe, and which you remember, Andreas and other friends from the Baltics, in the 1970s and 80s, the other Europe, were the satellites of Central and European Union and the three Baltic states. Now we are facing this big challenge, which is with the resolution of peace in Ukraine and the end of the Putin regime, it has to go together with a full, comprehensive and smart strategy towards the in-between states, the new Europe, whatever you call it, but certainly not Russia's near abroad. I would like to answer one of Gary's Kasparov's question of saying, yes, there are millions, and I would say more than millions, but tens of millions of people who live in Russia, because as you know, more than 20% of people who live in Russia are not Russians. So it's very important to stress this. And tens of millions who live in a very, very difficult situation and would certainly be relieved if Russia were governed differently. But many of them cannot say it, cannot even understand the problem. They don't have the means, and certainly they will never tell it to a journalist, especially a foreign journalist, in the street of Moscow or another big city. So I think we have a problem also with our media presenting a Russian society that clearly doesn't exist. There is no Russian society. It's a very fragmented human and social space, and we have to study the different parts of this human community that still resides in the Federation of Russia. And Gary, there is really one proposal that has been made, and that I have very much welcomed, which is to at long last create an official representation of democratic Russia somewhere in Europe. And I think you might be welcome to base it in Paris now, which would be a very big sign, better than have it in Vilnius, or if you have it in Paris, I think it would make a lot of sense. And I think you should work on it, just an official representation, so that what was said at the beginning, which I don't fully agree with, which is that our governments would be afraid of a Russian defeat because we're afraid of what will happen in Russia. This is long gone. This we could discuss maybe a year ago, but this is no longer true. I don't think you will find any members of government in our countries who would actually be afraid of what happens after a Ukrainian victory. So there is still, quite a lot, I think, that we can do together to change the terms of the discussion a little bit. And also, since we have Benjamin with us, I believe there is a lot that could be accomplished with the British working very closely with continental European. It's the right time. It's really the right time. And there's much more to be done, which would show that even if the United States remains stuck, because even without Trump, it's still stuck in the support of Ukraine, the fact that the British would be much closer to continental Europe would be very valuable. Thank you.
Great. Really very, very interesting and very important discussion. And I see Maria put a lot of questions to all the speakers, immediately. So I see Vladislav wants to jump in. And here is a very important question, perhaps from our good friend Roland Fronenstein. If you see on the chat, Vladislav, exactly to you. But maybe I will use my power here. I will put one question at least, exactly on the same topic which we started to discuss, and I saw some small difference in between of what Vladislav was saying and Gary and even Benjamin on this, anti-Putin coalition or what should be, how things should go. And I remember well how much I was positively surprised when I looked into this Casablanca declaration, of Churchill and Roosevelt, and how Roosevelt explained, why, coalition, anti-Hitler coalition, why they need to push for unconditional surrender of Hitler. He said very simply, that first of all, it would be a mistake to negotiate with Hitler, either peace agreement or ceasefire agreement, because it will mean that Hitler after a few years will come back with a new power. And second, that defeat of Hitler does not mean defeat of German nation, but it means defeat of Nazi ideology. And that defeat is very much needed in order, to assist Germany after the war to come back to normality, let's say so. So, when I read, I said, okay, good. We can change two words, Hitler to Putin and Germany to Russia, and we shall have the whole formula. So my question is very simple: would we agree with that formula to be used again, in those circumstances? Should it work, And that is, because I see, well, it's it demands maybe a little bit longer elaboration, but I agree with Gary, because I don't see how the regime and how Putin can be, how regime can collapse without Ukrainian victory, without the trigger of Ukrainian victory, without the real defeat, I don't see, okay, something can happen, whatever, sometimes, something unpredictable can happen. But if to look into, in some way, systemic approach, then Ukrainian victory is exactly this trigger which can change the regime, and and in such a way, we can use again this formula of Roosevelt and Churchill, looking how things can start to change in Russia, after Ukrainian victory. So maybe Vladislav, then Gary, and maybe Benjamin will jump in, and then we shall look into other questions.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. I will try to address three questions which were put on by our attendees in the chat. So first of all, about the military surrender, about the Casablanca Declaration and whatsoever, and about whether something worse than Putin may arise in Russia. So my answers here will be that I don't trust, I don't believe in any kind of unconditional surrender of the Russian Federation. So therefore, my point, I will reiterate it, is that what the West can achieve and what it should propose and it should foster is the domestic coup d'etat which deposes Putin and starts negotiations between how Russia after the war should be organized. The West or the European Union or NATO should have a very active position here because, as it was mentioned many times, Russia will not transform itself without having some goal from abroad, set from abroad. So Germany after 1945 was transformed so successfully because it was almost immediately incorporated into the Marshall Plan, into the European Economic Community, and in the NATO structures. So therefore, my proposal is just to focus on Putin, not on defeat of Russia, but on taking out Putin, to negotiate with a new Russian elite, and to propose a plan of integrating Russia into the broader West, which should be presented before Putin falls, because it should be kind of perspective. Ukraine was so successful in democratizing because it saw its European perspective. Europeanism was the major goal of the Ukrainians. There is no such a goal for Russians, and all the slogans of the 90s are well discredited. So therefore, once again, I think that complete military destruction or defeat of Russia is impossible since Putin is there, because this means nuclear war, to my mind. The second point, there were several questions posed by the listeners, was about decolonizing post-colonial effects of the war, federalization of Russia, decolonization whatsoever. So Valery Pecker also said a lot of transforming the Russian Federation. This is the biggest question about the post-Putin's Russia, because to my mind, there is no any successful attempt of transforming empire into federation. Empires can dissolve, and they can dissolve quite peacefully if in the center of empire is a nation state. France, England, Italy, Germany, Spain, Portugal, they lost their colonies and surrendered to this nation state. And the nation state of former colonial empires, the metropolises, later formed the European Union, a club of imperial powers, by the way. 10 of 27 members of the European Union are the metropolises of former colonial empires. And now they are living peacefully between them, each other. So to my mind, Russia, the major mistake with Russia in 1991 was that the deconstruction of empire has stopped far short of producing something like a Russian national state, because the identity of post-Soviet states, Ukraine, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, everywhere, was formed about the arising nation feeling, national identity. In Russia, there is no national identity. Russia was composed as an empire built by Muscovy well before it became Russia in the 17th century. And so now it regained its imperial identity. It doesn't have any national one. And the Russian nationalism actually is not an enemy of the West. It's maybe a solution, because now it was actually annihilated by Mr. Putin in the first years of his reign and substituted by Russian imperialism. So therefore, federalization may not be a solution. It might be, a community of different states, a new Russian national state, and maybe Tatarstan, maybe Yakutia, maybe some other national states, which might be the best possible solution, not federalization, because Russia cannot federalize. I think Russian Federation cannot federalize in a sufficient nation. And the last very small point concerning Ms. Mendra's talk about the representation of the Russian opposition, I would say that among our listeners, there are two people, definitely Ilya Ponomarev and Alexei Sobchenko, who actually established such a representation in the United States several months ago. So of course, you can follow. It's a very timely idea, but it's not novel. It's already done. Thank you.
Okay. So now, Gary Kasparov, please.
I think we have to identify the meaning of some words, because it's repeating them without agreeing on the terms is a little bit counterproductive. And so unconditional surrender, as declared by Roosevelt and Churchill in 1943 against Germany, and unconditional surrender of Russia, they mean the same. It's a defeat of ideology, but militarily, it's not exactly the same. Unconditional surrender for Germany, and by the way, Japan as well, meant total destruction and eventually occupation. Nobody's going to cross Russian borders of 1991, but I disagree with Vladislav. There is no other way. Ukrainian flag on Sevastopol is the only precondition for changing Russia. Everything else is just, it's a wishful thinking. Oh, maybe cool. Prigozhin tried. The problem is, the war now is a core instrument of feeding Russians elite. They're around Putin because war is beneficial. Sanctions are great. They're evading sanctions. It's shadow economy. They're making money. Expecting a kind of a coup in Russia before military defeat is not a wishful thinking. It's naivete. So that's why you have to make moves. Move number one: Ukraine must win, and this win must convince not only Russian elite but Russian public the empire is dead. Empire still exists in their minds, and nothing short about Ukrainian flag in Sevastopol can kill the idea. We have to kill this virus, and then we'll see what comes next. I'm also not so sure that federalization is impossible, because people will have to face some tough choices. Yeah, it's easy to say, oh, Buryatia, Yakutia, Tatarstan, they can go on their own. Fine, I have no problem with Russian Federation or Russian Empire collapsing, but maybe people there will decide that they'd better come up with some kind of a loose confederation, which I think it's many regions will eventually decide it, because the choice is not going on their own. It's either you stay within new Russian Confederation or you become China, which is sitting there and waiting for the collapse of Russian empire. And by the way, that's another major factor that scares Americans and mostly Americans, but also Europeans. So that's why, again, it's the unconditional surrender. It's a liberation of Ukraine in this case. It's unconditional surrender of the imperial idea. And as long as this idea is alive, we will never have a chance to change Russia. So that's one. Now, two is this is about opening the office. And Maria, it's again wishful thinking. Nice. What is democratic Russia? Tell me. I don't understand the term. It's absolute nonsense. It existed 30 years ago. Today, how can I identify it? And also, please stop applying the word democratic Russia. Many Russians who are fighting in Russian battalions there, they're not Democrats. I would not agree with them on anything because many of them are nationalists. But they're fighting for Ukraine now. Who's who's doing more for the future of Russia? The Democrats who are going around European capitals, or those who are fighting, on the Ukrainian side. So that's why I think it's very important again to start making moves in the right order. It's just opening an office means you will have small groups of Russian political politicians in exile competing. Who is going to be the main voice? I don't want that. That's why, please, start offering Russians who are in Russia now or spread around the world a chance to become citizens, digital citizens of a country that is not Putin. You have to start building a matrix of new Russia, a free Russia. That's why I use the word Taiwan, not to be confused about government and exile. So Tikhanovsky is sitting around for 4 years. So what did happen? Tell me. I didn't see any progress because, again, there's a strategy. Strategy should be, defeating Russian troops in Ukraine, liberating Ukraine, creating conditions for Putin's collapse, and at the same time preparing the matrix for future Russia. You can't have democratic Russia representing nobody. Why not pretending we represent 140 million people? But let's have 2 or 3 million people that are willing to say, war is criminal, regime legitimate, Crimea is Ukraine. We would like to cut ties with Putin, offer them a chance to go to Yerevan, sign declaration, and become this, give them nonsense passport, something that will separate them from Putin and Russia. And among them, you can start building this democratic Russia. And again, please, you remove what's democratic, because as Vladislav said correctly, many Russian nationalists actually are our strong allies, because this is the difference that so many people missed in the free world. There was a nationalism, imperial nationalism, the Soviet nationalism, and the nationalism, the Russian nationalism. And many Russian nationalists, though, again, I would disagree on them on many issues, probably most of all, but they wanted to see a Russia as a national state. And that's the article I wrote back in 2006, creating Russian political nation, same melting pot as in America. I'm, half Armenian, half Jewish. I'm not a drop of Russian blood, but I'm Russian by language, by culture. So creating Russian national state based on national identification. So this is the way we move forward. And here again, I agree with Vladislav, that may become a core of future federation if God forbid, we can pass through so many obstacles. So again, let's not utilize the words that are meaningless. Let's recognize that there is a number of correct moves that we have to make, and also let's look into the future with optimism, because again, Russian empire must die. Russian Federation, Russian Confederation, Russian common space may be required to continue our battle against totalitarianism, which again will be eventually represented as our main enemy from China. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gary. Thanks a lot. And now maybe I will ask first of all Benjamin Tallis to react, and then Valery will elaborate on, let's say, on joint Russian and German, opinion, and then we shall conclude with Maria, on some issues also. So please, Benjamin.
Many thanks, and a pleasure to follow on from what Gary just said. I would also say it's extremely important not to make this comparison to Nazi Germany. I have to say, sorry to disappoint you on that one, Andreas, from my side, because there is no chance of that occupation. There is no chance of the same kind of defeat in this case as there was before. And so I don't really buy Marie's proposal on that regard either. We have to deal with the situation as it is and get it towards where we want it to be, not actually dealing with that in a wishful thinking way. So I don't think that is the same. But on what you said about the defeat of the German nation, I also would disagree with that a little bit, or push back a little, because when Richard von Weizsäcker said, who was president of Germany in 1985, his family had close ties to the Nazi regime, of course, he said we were defeated, and it was that defeat that liberated us from the Nazi ideology. That Germans were liberated by that defeat. And that's something people do point to as a comparison, but it's important to note that actually it was the defeat of the German nation who had facilitated and bore responsibility for Nazism, as well as the defeat of Nazi ideology. So I think just a couple of clarifying points that I think are important to put out there. In terms of the UK, I think this is a really interesting question, and it's certain you can see that Lord Cameron is making great rhetorical efforts to put the UK back centre stage here. But it's really undermined by the fact that the Sunak government has lost all energy, has lost all willingness to commit to foreign policy and military policy in a serious way. At the very time, or shortly after the British Defence Secretary had said, we are no longer in a post-war world, we are in a pre-war world, they cut the defence budget. I mean, that's just not a credible way to behave. That's ridiculous. And it's also, it really shows the level to which everyone is waiting for the election in the UK. The Tories are not going to do much more beyond the rhetorical stance that Cameron is bringing. And I think he is bringing diplomatic energy. Let's see who else he can persuade to come on board. But without a strong material commitment from the UK, it doesn't ring true, and it doesn't give us what we need. There's a bigger issue at hand, though, is that the UK is running into the limits of a lot of its own contradictions. It's not just to do with Brexit, although that's a big part of it. So even a new incoming government will not have much money to spend on this. You've seen the Labour leader Keir Starmer cutting back on key pledges from the environment, for the Green New Deal, technological investment, etc., all the way across the various policy platforms or policy fields. So I wouldn't expect miracles from a new incoming government either. And this, to a certain extent, is because of problems that not only the UK faces in resource terms and economic terms, it does, but there's other problems that are more common across the democratic world. And this speaks to some of the questions in the chat a little bit. I think we're not seeing this coalition for victory in a serious way, where means are connected to ends, where the money is connected to the goal. Because we don't have a strategy, we don't, and this has been mentioned as well, but we actually lack a strategy beyond the war. We don't really know who we are or what we want. There's the crisis of confidence in the Western system here. We've seen that over the last 20 years, ebbing and flowing, rising and falling in different ways. But it's really come to a key point in the last few years with saying, what is it that we stand for? And this points to Marie's comments about, is it the free world? Is it the West? Who is it we're talking about here? Because there's not the kind of sense of unifying mission and more in common notion that there was during parts of the Cold War, then it's become very difficult to actually go from saying who we are to what we want and how we go about shaping it in the future. So that lack of vision, lack of certainty about who we are, and lack of actual belief in the superiority of our systems, because, and this is certainly something that's very commonly discussed in Germany, the manifest failings of those systems. So we have an awful lot of work to do if we want to win this systemic competition, not only to win the war in Ukraine, but to win the systemic competition against authoritarian regimes. We have a lot of work to do to renew our democratic societies domestically as well. And that means political economy as well. That means sharing the benefits of freedom in a different way than we have in the recent past, while continuing to harness the dynamism of free societies and linking that to foreign policy in a meaningful way. That's the only way we're going to get the material we need to defend the free world, but also the mindset. And that's, I think, crucial to this. We need to actually have that renewal process, and defending and renewing will give us the platform to be able to then spread the free world. But we have really a lot of, I think, conceptual work, intellectual work, and practical work to do to make that come true again. Very last point is in relation to what Marie was saying. Again, sorry, I'm not picking on you. I'm just triggered by a couple of your comments. It was nice to hear that you talk to people in Berlin who get this, who are on the right page. But across different parts of government, across ministries, across the political parties, there is a fear of a collapse of Russia. There is a fear of what that would bring. There is massive uncertainty about that. And there is real hesitance to push forward for Ukrainian victory. It's not everyone. There are people across the political parties who get it, but it's not enough. And those who do get it are not standing up strongly enough to those who don't. So while some of the Greens and the FDP have been very strong on the need to stand up to Vladimir Putin, they haven't yet shown they can stand up to Olaf Scholz. And that creates a problem for us that needs to be solved. Thanks. I have to dash off early, I'm afraid. But thank you very much for the discussion today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Benjamin. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Now I'm looking to Valery, please.
Thank you, sir. 4 points, ladies and gentlemen. First, the death of Putin alone or military defeat of Russian forces in Ukraine alone don't guarantee anything without deep political changes in the Russian political regime. Because Putin could be replaced by Putin 2.0, and defeat of Russian forces with Putin or with Putin 2.0 means just escalation of the war after certain ceasefire. Second, we mentioned destiny of Ukraine and Moldova and Belarus and Georgia, but destiny of all those countries, including Estonia, Poland, and Lithuania, are inseparably connected to destinies of Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Chechen Republic, Kalmyk Republic, Sakha-Yakutia, and so on. So first, we have to acknowledge that Russian Empire is an empire, is a colonial state. We should open the book of non-Russian history of all those nations and peoples, and we should not compare Russian Empire to overseas empires like Spain or Portugal or the Netherlands and so on. We should compare Russian Empire with Ottoman Empire or Austrian Empire. And this good comparison will provide us with the insight that there will be no national state without decolonization. First is decolonization and deimperialization, and then national state appears, as it was in case of Austrian Republic and Turkey, because there was no national idea in empire, and it couldn't be there. And we shouldn't be afraid of some independent states during the refederalization process. There will be indeed some independent states. This doesn't mean collapse of Russia. This is a manageable process, manageable by new elites, and mentioned the 4 risks of proliferation of radical Islamism, of Chinese influence, and of humanitarian crisis. They all are mitigated. They all are avoided by creation of some national states, if any, will appear during this refederalization process. Third point, definitely we should not compare a Russian Empire with Nazi Germany, but I would like to remind you about one simple point about 2 plans, Marshall Plan and Morgenthau Plan. So if we would like to see Russia big, poor, and not so clever, without best human capital, without industry, without anything, it will be just a source of revanchism and of extremist influence across the world. We should not invent Morgenthau Plan for Russia. We should invent Marshall Plan for Russia, to make Russia not poor but rich, not autocratic but democratic, not imperial but federal, not lift without best human capital, but with best human capital. Because if all best human capital will be lifted from Russia, who will transform Russia into a state which could be a good neighbor of Europe? And last but not least, I'm absolutely sure that escalation and Russian attacks to some European countries, which are formally under umbrella of NATO, but just formally, is just a matter of time. I'm absolutely sure that all decisions are already made. It is just a matter of time. It wouldn't be look like tank brigades like in February 2022 in Ukraine. It would be a combination of drones, missiles, cyber attacks, social network splitting of societies, extremist groups, private military companies, and so on and so on. So escalation is just a matter of time. Nuclear fears are irrational. Nuclear fears led some people to believe that Putin can threat nuclears and then threatened by nuclears, kill any number of people in any country, kill any economy across the Europe, can overthrow governments across the Europe and so on, just heating these irrational nuclear fears. So Western leaders should show some courage now, otherwise they will face the necessity to show a lot of courage later. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Valery. Our time is coming to almost to the end. So Maria and I see that Gary Kasparov wants to maybe to comment. I will, Maria, before you will answer to all the comments which were made. I would add additional comment, and additional question. Since we see really President Macron now is showing some kind of this, leadership. With some formulation of what I call grand narratives or possibility of grand strategy. And since you were speaking about much broader region, and we are speaking here about quite a broad region, including Ukraine, and then how Ukraine victory can influence, the changes in Russia. Of course, Belarus is very much interconnected, and do you see possibility to have some kind of grand strategy for what I would call Europe East, where all those things which were here we were discussing, would be combined into the major goal of transformation of Europe East, and that strategy should start, from very much from Ukraine, because Ukraine is what we as a West we can do, What Valery is speaking about, transformations in Russia. So I see only two elements which depend on us, on the West. One, and which can influence, Russian transformation. One thing is Ukraine victory and Ukraine success with, membership in EU and NATO. And second is, promise of some kind of Marshall Plan for Russia, modernization plan for Russia, if Russia is becoming a democratic and normal country. Everything else will depend on the people of Russia. We shall not influence. We can just create some kind of conditions. We are not occupying Russia, like it was done, after Second World War. So our possibilities is, like Gary is saying, Ukrainian flag in Sevastopol, defeat of Russian army in Ukraine, collapse of Putin regime, and then possibility that it will bring some changes inside of Russia, with a new regime, with somebody, new people. And then, showing example of Ukraine's success with all the memberships in EU and NATO. Those are our instruments, but they should be, combined into what I call grand strategy. And President Macron is exactly, how to say, I see his, way of thinking. Maybe he can bring some kind of.
Thank you very much, Andrius, for adding up and discussing, I think, the major points I wanted to make. And I wish, in new further discussion that we have, that we really talk about what to do, and not those big words about, you are not going to use this word, you're not going to compare with Nazi Germany. I never compared with Nazi Germany. I said, we have an issue of very evil, dangerous, murderous regimes, and they usually, in most cases we know, there is a military surrender followed by a political or state surrender. And thank you to the very last comment that I read on the discussion. Yes, it is the state Russia that needs to surrender. So what you said, Andreas, are two very important points. First, if we want to move on, a better, quicker, more efficient strategy to make sure that Ukraine can win militarily, and then that we can all win politically and in security terms. We need secure people, a secure Europe, a secure continent. We must look at the bigger picture. And this is why I think it's absolutely necessary that we think about the other states in between, or Europe East, or the new and large Europe. And also, it is extremely important that we understand, and I think that we do maybe better than some of our Russian colleagues. We cannot influence Putin. We cannot influence his clan, his group. We cannot influence even a big businessman that are under sanctions and have not chosen to leave the country. You know, it's too late. If they had left just before Putin wanted to launch the aggression 2 years ago, then they might have saved their skins. Now it's too late for them. If Putin explodes, they explode as well. If Putin commits suicide, they commit suicide with him, which is also my way of responding to the question about, well, nuclear strikes, no nuclear strikes. Let's think about what it means for those guys and making those insane decisions in the last 2 years in Moscow. So thank you, Andreas, and I really wish very much that we can pursue on those lines, because I can tell you, it may not be the case in Berlin, but I can tell you that in France, the terms of the debate are clearly changing. And this is important. Only idiots do not change their minds, right? And honestly, I hope next time we have a German, maybe politician or deputy, or who I think will also be able to say how close cooperation amongst ourselves in Europe are important. And this is what helped Emmanuel Macron and his government and many deputies think about the whole issue differently. And all of the work we do, you know, scholars, expert journalists. So it's our job. Instead of being fatalists who are saying, you know, the Germans will always be the German, the French will always be the German, the French. No, this is not true. So there was a question from Afrenim. Well, yes, France is changing its immigration policy and is making it much closer to the German policy. But I wouldn't have told you that had we met 4 weeks ago. Why? Because I've been advising this a special delegation within the Ministry of the Interior, of Internal Affairs, about a new immigration policy. And it's also because they read what I wrote and what others have been writing, and what we have said about the importance of working very closely with Russian elites that are in forced exile in our countries. Because that's what in France, what we did very successfully in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with our Polish, Hungarian, Czech friends from the hostage Eastern Europe. We have fantastic experience of all this, as we have, as French and Germans, a fantastic and very useful experience in reconciliation between France and Germany after 1945, under international supervision and with a Marshall Plan. Thank you, Andreas, for mentioning it, because I think one thing we should do right now is start putting it on paper, this Marshall Plan. We have to be like the Ukrainians. We have to anticipate. The Ukrainians started reconstructing a destroyed building at the very beginning of the war. We are always late. You know, we're running behind, late behind Ukraine. Another question by Roman, if I'm not mistaken, that we didn't, that said that we did recognize Putin's election. No country recognized Putin's election, with a very, very few exceptions. I think 1 or 2 European leaders maybe congratulated him. No. And that was a big question that we've discussed, and that I've discussed with Macron's close advisors on the issue, with many deputies at several meetings, with, you know, it's been, you know, the full months of January and February have been about, would it be symbolic, not symbolic? What should we do? So it's very clear to everybody in government in France and amongst deputies that this man was not re-elected, because it was not an election. Basta. That's it, period. So do not worry. the plebiscite of the fabricated plebiscite of mid-March has worked against Putin in the sense of our discussion. That yes, we can live better without Putin, and that will not necessarily be the collapse of the populations and infrastructure in the Federation of Russia. It will be the collapse of a clan, of a system. And we know that what you have missed in the Soviet Union was the full de-Stalinization in the 1950s and 60s. And now what you missed in Russia and what they miss in Ukraine, and we miss too, is a full de-Chekaization or dismantling of authoritarian, corrupt states that Gary, you very nicely described in many writings, and Khodorkovsky also, and of course Navalny and many others. There was also a question from Nino about is there a strategy of defeating Russia? And yes, I think we have a strategy of defeating the Russian army, although the Ukrainians are doing the job on the ground, but maybe not forever. As Vladimir Milov once said very nicely, Macron in a way is right. We never know what to expect from Putin. So we cannot say that we're sure we won't do this or that. So things are very much now in the minds of our governments and of the EU and NATO, that with Putin, you never know, right? So defeat the Russian army and then defeat the leader of the clan and then his system. And then there will be a few years of transition under international supervision to accompany the people that are citizens of the Russian Federation to reconstruct, because Russia is becoming just a battlefield of ruins in terms of economy, human behavior, family life, social. It's not being bombed, but Putin really is creating chaos. So I think I said most of I wanted to say. Just that, of course, I follow very closely what's being done also in the US, and and Lev Ponomaryov is a close friend here in Paris. I'm sorry, but it's not at all what I had in mind about having some form of body that represents, free Russia, that represents the minority, the active minority. History is made by active minority. They don't represent, they don't pretend to represent millions of people that have been hostages of a dictatorship for a number of years, but that's how breaking points happen. And if you always talk from your point of view of exiled Russians, but I would like you to understand our point of view, that if we are to have a big strategy, we need precisely to fight this strange, odd idea that we still have in France, that we don't know what's come about after Putin, so we don't know what's going to come. So if we want to defeat this odd fear of vacuum after Putin and this horrific war, then our job is to talk to you and many others, to talk also to the Ukrainians and to show that there is an alternative elite, that there are alternative constitutional proposals for something that might be a federation, might not be a federation. All this is on. And so when you tell us that we should just forget about this part of the job, which is showing to our people in Europe and our government that there is a Russia after Putin, then I think, you know, it's just a big misunderstanding between us. And I certainly don't have in mind, and nobody here has in mind, a boss or a new Politburo of some kind of free Russia. Of course not. None of you will be there. You know, I mean, we don't expect any of you opponents of today to succeed Putin, because there is no succession to a dictator after such a bloody war. It's not a question of a successor. So I would just ask you very much to try also and understand what is the mission for us in Europe to be able to continue to support Ukraine and convince our people that they do not need to fear what's going to come afterwards, because we are already preparing for that. We are already anticipating. We already have many working groups at all levels. And we will not forget about the Russian and let them sort of survive after Putin's chaos. We will be there. We will not occupy Russia, but we will be an international body that will make sure that law prevails. You know, law and security prevail for the people, because this is what the Putin system has deprived the Russians. You know, it's law and security. Thank you very much to all.
Thanks a lot, Maria. Thanks a lot. And really, we are totally out of time.
Yes.
Guys,
Yeah, but I think it's important. It's an important discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely important.
I think it's yes. I think, Andres, I think it's important to end up, you know, council wars here. I wonder what Ukrainians who are now under Russian bombs in Kharkiv would think about this conversation. Yeah, I'm frankly speaking, I'm getting sick. You know, oh, we're congratulating.
I'm having this conversation with Ukrainian.
No.
I'm talking to Ukrainian friends.
I listen to you. I listen to you. Sorry, I didn't say a word. Please, you know, just so you said no. Excuse me. This is not not the way I have conversation. It's just you're teaching us what to do, and we had this. We haven't recognized.
You were dismissing my point.
No, that's not. I'm sorry, Andres. I'm not going to talk because this is it's 15 minutes. We're listening to you, and now just you don't give me 2 minutes to answer.
No, please go on.
I think it's outrageous. I'm really outraged now. It's self-congratulating. NATO is getting stronger. Yes, cemented by Ukrainian blood. Oh, we did. How many French presidents have been bought by Putin? 25 years he has been doing everything he wanted, and now you say, we have not recognized you. BS. You have not even recalled your ambassador to show your disrespect to Putin. So that's why, again, stop talking. Ukraine is losing the war now. People are being killed. And you're talking about the future, rule of law. You have to save Ukraine now. And so far, the French military contribution to Ukraine is minuscule. So again, we have to recognize winning the war is the #1 priority. I agree, by the way, comparing to Nazi Germany is probably not the best thing, but we're still talking about Marshall Plan, Morgenthau Plan. Winning the war is a top priority. And I'm trying to come up with some concrete suggestions. And instead, we are having a bunch of words. How we move here, how we move there. Again, before every next meeting in July, Ukraine may collapse. Kharkiv will fall probably in a month or two unless something is being done. No, we just have to talk about the future of Russia, how we disrespect Putin. Putin is in charge now, and unfortunately, unless we defeat him militarily, nothing will happen. There's no guarantee that will happen. And by the way, don't talk about our country, just decide how you're going to fix it. We don't know yet, but we'll try. We, by the way, have been doing it for many, many years. Again, despite the fact that your elites have been bought by Putin for decades. So we tried to talk about Putin's being a danger back in 2001, in 2005, in 2007, and you ignored us. So that's why, again, right now, let's concentrate on one thing. defeating Putin in Ukraine is a top priority. And so far, I heard nothing about concrete measures. How we do that to make sure Ukraine survives and wins the war. Thank you.
Okay, good. It's very clear that we shall need to have even more conversations in order for us to have a proper understanding what is very much needed. I absolutely agree that Ukrainian victory is a priority, but in order to have Ukrainian victory, we need to have Western support, much bigger than it was till now. In order to have Western support, the West needs to get rid of their fears about the future of Russia. That's why, in order to get enough of support, we need to talk about future of Russia and how we can do that future, such one which will not, we shall not be afraid of that. So that's why we are, talking some language which is very much needed, because what we agree today, that really Ukrainian victory is a must, is priority, and second, that really we need not to be afraid of change of regime in Russia, of Putin regime. That is what we want to see, and in order to do that, we need to convince the West to go ahead. Till now, we spent 2 years, taking care about how not to allow Ukraine to lose. But now we understand that we need to have much more clear vision, how really Putin regime needs to be forced to collapse and how we need to achieve real defeat of Russia itself, in order really to help Russia to become a free country. That's our vision, because this is the only way for sustainable peace on the European continent. At the end, to have different Russia, different Belarus, and so on. So that is why we need to have some kind of what I call, grand strategy. And I see some progress into that direction. So I see that our time really, we shall be switched off technically, very soon. So I will really would like to thank all of you for really very important discussion, sometimes emotional, but I think that this is exactly, the issues which we are discussing demands from us, emotions and engagement and passion, and that's clear. Ukrainian victory is a must, and that is why we are, keeping our job. Somebody asked, what will be after European elections. I can say very clearly, I am running. I hope the democracy in Lithuania will make its proper, positive decision, and that means that we shall continue our conversations. Thanks a lot to everybody.